This is Open Door with Vince Robinson. In-depth conversations with people who are making a difference in the lives of others here and around the world. Culture is at the heart of who you are. Know your culture, find yourself on Open Door with Vince Robinson.
Grand dawning, great rising, Cleveland, Ohio, and the rest of planet Earth. Welcome to another edition of Open Door with Vince Robinson. My guest this morning earned his law degree from Cleveland Marshall College of Law in 1968 and began his legal career with stints at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and as an assistant city prosecutor before entering private practice. He played a major role in desegregating Cleveland's public schools and focused his practice on school desegregation across the country. In addition to civil rights and criminal defense, he served as the legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio, first vice president and chair of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP, and chair of Citizens for a Safe and Fair Cleveland. As well as being a lawyer and activist, he's been an educator in the Cleveland public school system and an adjunct professor on civil rights in Baldwin-Wallace College's political science department. That's a mouthful, but I'm pleased to welcome to the air Mr. James Lloyd Hardiman. How you doing today, Brother Hardiman?
Pretty good. That was a mouthful.
It was. And, you know, it's interesting, Jim, because I looked up your bio and I saw that there was another James Hardiman, and he was not a brother. He didn't have anything to do with Cleveland, but everything about his pedigree related to him being Irish. Obviously, you're not, but I would say that you've probably done as much, if not more, in your practice. So, again, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to bring you to Open Door, and just know that I'm speaking to a person of significant history in the city of Cleveland. So why don't we start with what you did with relation to desegregation of Cleveland's public schools?
Well, that's a topic that would take several hours. I'll try to condense it as best I can. First of all, I'm a product of the Cleveland school system. After my involvement with the Cleveland school system, I taught in the Cleveland school system. And after my teaching career ended, I sued the Cleveland school system. So I'm enmeshed in Cleveland schools. But to make a long story short, Cleveland for well over a century did not have any official statute or policy relative to segregating students on the basis of race. But they were able to accomplish racial segregation in different ways. To begin with, they assigned black teachers to predominantly black schools. They also permitted black schools to be overcrowded, whereas the white schools were underutilized. They oftentimes would make sure that when black students went to some of the previously all white schools because of overcrowding, they were kept intact. By that I mean it would be one group of black students in an all white school. They were not permitted to have any interaction with the other students. They were not even permitted to go out onto the playground and participate in activities. So it was a situation in which, although there was no specific statute which either required or even permitted racial segregation, Cleveland was able to accomplish it through a variety of different techniques. So following a number of cases around the country, including Brown versus Board of Education, which is the 1954 seminal case that said separate is inherently unequal, the Cleveland branch of the NAACP decided to challenge the practices in the city of Cleveland relative to racial segregation in the public schools. At the time, Nathaniel Jones was the general counsel for the NAACP. So he led the fight. I was a young attorney trying to get my feet wet, and I was able to participate with some of the people who I consider to be great lawyers, if not the greatest lawyers. In any event, we sued the Cleveland Board of Education, the Cleveland Superintendent of Schools, the State Board of Education, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Governor, and the Attorney General. And we alleged that the segregation was not solely the result of housing patterns, but it was the result of official acts by various school personnel, which had the probable and foreseeable effect of creating racially identifiable schools. When the trial started, the attorneys for the state and the Cleveland schools acknowledged that the schools were segregated. So that was no longer an issue. The issue became how they became segregated. The school system said that they were a result of housing patterns, but we were able to prove, and the court accepted our proof, that there were a couple of hundred different instances in which the Cleveland Board of Education, along with the state, had created, fostered, and maintained racial segregation. That was the first part of the case. We called it the liability decision. The second part of the case, which, looking back, was much more involved and intense, was the remedy. Because at the end of the day, even acknowledging segregation, even acknowledging that it was intentionally caused, the question became one of, well, what do you do about it? Is the cure worse than disease, which is what many people said. But Judge Battisti, who is now deceased, ruled that not only would student reassignment be a requirement, but there would also have to be a number of components that would have to be implemented in order to eliminate the vestiges of racial segregation. Some examples included testing, counseling, the use of magnet schools, safety and security, reading programs, staff desegregation, which should have been really, really easy. And the most controversial aspect of the remedial order was transportation. Students were reassigned, some black students to the west side, to the schools that had previously been predominantly white, and some white students to the east side, to schools that had been predominantly black. The effect was to eliminate, to the extent practicable, racial segregation in the Cleveland schools. It's still a very controversial decision, but I feel very comfortable in saying racial segregation in the Cleveland public schools was properly addressed by Judge Battisti, Nathaniel Jones, Tom Atkins, and yours truly, James Hardiman.
I have to ask the question as a follow-up, and you say that it was addressed properly by the judge, but I'm curious about what the impact was. Did it really have a significant impact on the quality of education that students received as a result?
Well, the quality of education was the real test. And we never maintained that having black students sit next to white students would automatically improve the quality of education. And that's why those educational components that I talked about were so important, because a portion of a child's education takes place in the classroom, but another portion takes place outside of the classroom. Extracurricular activities, for example, the magnet programs that we were able to implement, the reading programs, which was a requirement in the sense that black students were not reading on the same level as their white counterparts. So we were successful in getting some of those proven reading programs implemented in the Cleveland school system. The problem is that in 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that a metropolitan remedy was not required in the absence of any kind of allegation of segregation by the suburban school district. So when Cleveland was desegregated, it was a Cleveland-only remedy. Whereas if there had been a metropolitan remedy, I think we would have gone a lot further. But for the period of time that the Cleveland schools were under the control of the federal court, I can say that it did improve the quality of education. Did it last long enough to have any lasting effect? I don't think so, because if we look at our schools today, they are resegregated. Black students go to now schools that were once upon a time predominantly white, and now they're predominantly black. The reading programs are in effect, which have had some effect on the ability of students to perform, but it didn't go far enough. So, if anything, I don't believe that Cleveland and the state were totally sincere. And I'll say that the state was more inclined to try and address the problem than was the Cleveland Board of Education. But when Judge George White assumed responsibility for the case, it became somewhat more problematic. And I think Judge White was simply of the opinion that this had gone on long enough, and it was time to return control of the Cleveland schools to the Cleveland state defendants. So where does that leave us today? We came a long way during those times between 1973 and 1998. We still have a long way to go. And school desegregation is not now in vogue. Back then it was known as the busing case. We prefer to refer to it as the school desegregation matter. And school systems all over the country are wrestling with underperforming black students. And what we strongly believe is that relegating students to a school that is all one race, be it black or white, does those students a disservice. Some people might remember the doll test, where they would show students, black students, a white doll and a black doll, and ask which one looked like them and which one was a good doll. And it turned out that the black students would always favor the white doll with blonde hair. The white students also would favor the white doll with blonde hair. And those types of tests were conducted more recently, and the results had not significantly changed. So, though we made some progress, we still have a long way to go. And I think the 1954 Brown decision, which just recently had an anniversary, May 17th, if I recall correctly, was the anniversary of the 1954 Brown decision. It was a starting point. But in 1954, school districts, particularly in the South, there's some in the North, refused to address the situation. And as a result, in 1955, the Supreme Court had to dictate that timetable-wise, the school district had an obligation to desegregate with all deliberate speed, whatever that means. In some cases, it meant the school district would drag their feet. In other instances, it meant the school district would do whatever they can and whatever they should. Insofar as Cleveland is concerned, as I said initially, there were no laws which required or permitted racial segregation, but they were able to effect that racial segregation in other ways. We have found, looking at the research, that black students who attend desegregated or hopefully integrated school systems do better academically. Now, they still are not up to the same level as their white counterparts, but they do better. And white students that attend segregated schools, there's no significant effect on the caliber of their education.
Yes.
So this is an ongoing issue.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. And it's all against the backdrop of the historic segregation that has occurred in the city. You know, we live in a city that for the longest time was white side is west side, black side is east side. And we've dealt with that whole dynamic of opposition and polarity. I want to talk to you about the current state of things and perhaps some ideas that you might have for improving things when we return, and we can continue our conversation about civil rights in Cleveland. This is Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU. My guest is attorney James Hardiman. We'll be right back after this.
This is DJ Chris Stiles, programs and music director here at WOVU 95.9 FM. Our Voices United, a Burton Bell Carr community radio station. WOVU 95.9 FM sends a big thank you to the entire staff of the St. Luke's Foundation and President and CEO Timothy Tramble for awarding WOVU 95.9 FM $25,000 to purchase the WOVU 95.9 FM mobile vehicle. On behalf of our entire team, our Executive Director, Joy Johnson, and Executive Board, we said thank you, St. Luke's Foundation, for continuing addressing social determinants of health for our people in our neighborhoods and throughout Cuyahoga County. Thank you. This message is being brought to you by WOVU 95.9 FM, Our Voices United, a Burton Bell Carr community radio station.
Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson and my conversation with attorney James Lloyd Hardiman. It says that you're from Solon, but I know you have an extensive history in the city of Cleveland, as evidenced by the conversation that we've had about the desegregation of Cleveland's public school system. And that whole busing thing, you know, looking back at it, I just wonder if it was just a boon for bus companies in a sense, because you had students on the west side who were leaving public schools because their parents didn't want them sitting next to black children in their classroom. So it had an impact on the system as well. But you talked about the fact that we haven't really made a whole lot of progress. You didn't say those exact words, but those were the implications that I took from what you said. What kinds of things do you think can be done to improve the situation?
Well, first of all, there would have to be a commitment to desegregation. And I don't just mean in the city of Cleveland, but I mean among the suburban schools as well. Having students play on the same football team or basketball team is not the same as having a strong commitment to desegregating the segregated schools. You can oftentimes look at a school system's athletic teams and determine to some degree what the composition of the school is. And if school systems were inclined to do more than just pay lip service to the fact that they believe in diversity, but to make a real commitment, then I think that would be the first step. The second step is, I think we're past the point where we can expect the courts to address the problem. I think it's a legislative problem. And I think the state legislature should step up and recognize that segregation is not to the benefit of anyone. Maybe I'm old school, but I still believe that in Brown versus Board of Education, where the court said separate is inherently unequal, is accurate. I believe that separate is inherently unequal. So if it's unequal, then I think it's our obligation as responsible adults to address it, and not just having people in the band playing together or the running back on the football team being a black person. But I think there has to be a real commitment to try and instill the belief that segregation is better than segregation. Desegregation is better than segregation.
Yeah. I have to ask at this moment, since you invoked the idea of legislation and looking at the climate and the state house downstate and the Republican control of the education system, the moves that the governor has made to gain even more control, how realistic is it for us to think that they would be conscious enough to do the kinds of things that you suggest?
Well, I'm not totally of the belief that suddenly the state legislature that is controlled by Republicans will wake up and decide that they want to do the right thing. Being a realist, I want to believe that we've made some progress, not where we wanted to be, not where we should be, but we've made some incremental progress over the years. And now, I think that even though conservatives control the state legislature, at least in the state of Ohio, I think that with time, that will change. And with that type of change, there may be an inclination to recognize the obvious, which is segregation is inherently unequal. And when we start to talk about equality, we have to recognize that historically, black students have been sent to inferior schools. They live in inferior neighborhoods. Oftentimes they live in high crime areas, but they are expected to perform and achieve on the same level as their white counterparts. So when we see black students underperforming or not being able to address basic educational standards, then there has to be a reckoning. And we can go on and stick our heads in the sand and act like it's not an issue, but it is an issue, even in the criminal justice system. Oftentimes we found that many of the people that are involved on every level of the criminal justice system did not get, I want to say a good education, but an education. So at some point, I'm optimistic, maybe not in my lifetime, but at some point, the legislature will recognize the obvious, and that is they've got an obligation to address the situation, and sticking their heads in the sand is not going to address it.
Yes. You know, I don't want to use the term devil's advocate, but I do want to bring up something that people talk about all the time, and that is the impact that integration had on black business. And I know it's not necessarily directly tied to education, but there have been folks like the Nation of Islam and others who advocate for black institutions. And you, of course, you have historically black colleges and universities, which are not predominantly black necessarily, but they have significant right. black populations. And so when I think about this idea of segregation, I think sometimes it's really a matter of resources. It's not to say that you couldn't have separate and quality education, but you don't, because of the way the system has been designed. And I don't really think it's realistic to think that, you know, all of a sudden black folks would get the resources that they needed to have to be empowered to make the most of being together as a group. You know, it's funny, Jim, that when other groups have some type of pride about themselves, have this idea of their collective power, their strength. You look at Italian American clubs, you look at Irish American clubs, you know, you have Asian entities, you have all these different groups, and they can be about themselves. But whenever it's time for black people to be about black people, all of a sudden it seems as though there's a racial paradigm that is connected to some bad thought that these black people doing something independently and by themselves is not a good thing.
When we first started considering desegregating the Cleveland schools, you are absolutely correct. There were a number of people, black people, who were totally opposed to it. And the argument was that, well, they're going to take all the good black teachers and send them to the white schools. Housing created this mess, and we're not going to be able to change it until we change housing patterns. And besides which, we got along just fine with the situation as it was. And these interlopers are coming in now trying to change a good thing. From my perspective, that was a misinterpretation of the facts. To suggest that the people that were attempting to desegregate the schools were not or did not have Cleveland's best interests at heart, I think, was totally false. At the time we filed the lawsuit, the president of the Board of Education was a black man, Arnold Pinckney. And he had done a lot, you may remember, or some of the older listeners may remember, that he ran for mayor. But the issue of school desegregation arguably split the black community, because there were certain black people who strongly believed that separate is inherently unequal. There were other black people that believed that this was just another attempt to divide the black community and suck the resources the black community had out of the black community. Those are legitimate concerns, but it's not an impossible situation to address. And committed people, in my opinion, would be able to address it.
Yeah.
If they were so inclined. I'm sorry, somebody came in.
Yeah.
I apologize.
That's interesting when you bring up that division amongst ourselves, because sometimes we can be our worst enemies because we can't get on the same page. And it's obvious when you look back that separate was unequal, because there was intentionality about making the separateness injurious, So, we've got a lot of work to do. I guess I could just put it in those terms, to wake folks up to certain realities that exist now. For instance, right now, we're dealing with a presidential election that is filled with so much uncertainty right now. And the division.
Tell me about it.
I mean, I don't think we could be more divided. We have black folks who are not engaged in voters, who have just given up on the system. We've got black voters who are considering voting Republican because they don't like the Democrat candidate because of the obvious weaknesses in that person's ability to run this country. And, that could be debatable because, some say he's got dementia. Some say it's a figment of our imagination. But we can all look and see for ourselves that something is not 100% right there. So, the question becomes what do we do, and how do we create the kind of unity that will enable us to have some type of leverage in the political process. You talked earlier about your childhood and certain things, inequities that you saw that were going on. And I'm just wondering if that was the fuel for your decision to go into the practice of law.
Well, I kind of backed into the practice of law. I wish there was some great awakening that I could talk about, and I woke up one day and said I wanted to change the world. But in reality, when I graduated from college, I was just so happy to get out of college. I didn't know what to do with myself. But after a year, I decided, I can't chase the kids around the hallway forever. So I got into what was then Cleveland Marshall College of Law, which is now Cleveland State College of Law. And I always felt, even in law school, that something was wrong with the system. I remember vividly a professor justifying the internment of Japanese during World War II. And I didn't know the basis, but it didn't pass the smell test as far as I was concerned. So I've been involved mainly because of the way I was treated and what I saw as basic inequities. The college I attended, they segregated students on the basis of race in dormitory assignments. They didn't have fraternities and sororities, with one exception, that welcomed black students. You knew that you were there primarily as an athlete, but the feeling was that you were being tolerated. And lo, these many years later, that still burns in my gut, the way I was treated, the way they intentionally discriminated on the basis of race, at least in my opinion. So, yes, I can make some changes. I paid some dues, but I'm not at the point yet where I can say I'm finished paying my dues. I think all people, particularly people who have or can develop some expertise, have responsibility. Whether they are inclined to discharge those responsibilities is another issue. Many of my friends say, well, I shouldn't bother to vote. It's not going to make a difference anyway. Well, yes, it will. many people will say, well, the police are just going to come into my neighborhood and do what they want to do anyway. Well, not if you stand up. And so I think though we've come a long way, we've still got an awful long way to go.
That's so true. And I want to talk to you about some things that happened within the school system last year with respect to a couple of football teams when we get back, because, you know, we think that we've made so much progress, but in so many ways, we're still where we were 50 years ago. This is Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU. This is Open Door, and my guest is attorney Jim Hardiman. This is Burton Bell Carr Community Radio. Back in a second.
Many people in our community dream of owning a home. Unfortunately, many also feel that that dream is out of reach. However, family, KeyBank is committed to changing that. KeyBank partners with a variety of mortgage programs focused on meeting the needs of borrowers, including offering down payment assistance, affordable and government loans, and solutions for first-time home buyers. A Key Community Mortgage is also a great way to help reach the goal of home ownership. It allows you to take advantage of low down payment options, and qualifying is easier than you might think. It's one more way KeyBank is supporting neighbors and neighborhoods in the communities that they proudly call home. To learn more, visit your local KeyBank branch and speak to a licensed mortgage loan officer. KeyBank and home lending products offered by KeyBank are not FDIC insured or guaranteed. Equal housing lender, NMLS number 399797.
This message has been brought to you by KeyBank and WOVU 95.9 FM. Our voices united. Burton Bell Carr Community Radio.
Welcome back to Open Door with Vince Robinson and the conversation with my guest, attorney James Hardiman. You know, as we were talking about education and current situations, I was thinking about a couple of football games last year that had to be canceled because one team didn't want to go to another city. I think Euclid may have been involved in that type of a controversy, and I'm not sure, but I think Solon schools were also involved in a controversial decision to relocate a football game. And it's just amazing that here we are this far into the 21st century, and we still have situations that involve race that you would think we should be past. Do you have any knowledge of those situations? And I just wonder what your thoughts might be.
Well, I remember one of the incidents in which there was a school that didn't want to go. I believe it was Euclid because of concerns about the safety of their football team. Black kids have been obligated to attend unsafe situations for years, and there never was any kind of uproar about it. But suddenly, when white students are put in a situation, and I'm not denigrating the concern that white parents have for their children, but I am inclined to suggest that there may be a double standard. We should not subject our students to an unsafe situation under any circumstances. But I think from what I know, that was kind of a overblown situation. But it's not unusual when you have schools that were previously all white or all black, and you introduce a new element into that environment, then it is ripe for what's the word I'm looking for? It's ripe for people who want to exploit the situation. So in that regard, I think that the adults in the room could have done a better job. I don't know of any students at any athletic event in the last 20 or 30 years that have been injured as a result of disruptive crowds on the one hand. But on the other hand, I kind of understand. I don't want my children assaulted and battered, but that might be a false narrative, because I don't think students, for the most part, at athletic events have to be concerned about their safety. But it makes for, man bites dog type of situation. Yeah. Because it shows that, these schools are unsafe and unsavory, and we shouldn't be sending our kids to these schools. Think about it. When schools were initially desegregated, the first thing to get desegregated usually was the basketball team and maybe the track team. The last thing to get desegregated were the cheerleaders. So you had situations in which the captain of the basketball team had to escort the winter queen to the dance floor, and if the captain of the basketball team happened to be black and the winter queen happened to be white, parents were all upset about that. And I think, I'm not sure if that's a legitimate analogy, but I do think that there is some concern among parents that are not necessarily well-founded and provide an excuse to exploit fears and concerns that we have.
Yes. You know, I'm reflecting on a viral video from maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago where there was this young lady who was walking across the stage for graduation, and she was about to shake one of the administrators' hands, who happened to be a black man, and her father bum rushed the stage to prevent that handshake from happening. And again, you saw it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
It's like, wow, you know, but ignorance is ignorance. It's been here for as long as we've been here. So it should come to no surprise that those kinds of things happen. But, you know, I'm just looking at your extensive experience in the field of civil rights, and just going back to 64 and 65, you know, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act.
Sure.
You know, these things have been in place, but at the same time, we don't have a guaranteed right to vote, as far as I know. It's something that has to be renewed periodically. This 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, things that had to be added to the Constitution because there was something wrong with the original document. I'm just wondering about how much progress we're making in terms of resolving some of the issues that we've had to face historically. You can go back to the George Floyd incident, and, you know, there was this idea after it happened, and America had this great epiphany that race is indeed an issue, that we're in a post-racist society, but we're not. They even use the term post-racial, but we've got a resolution passed by Cleveland City Council that racism is a public health crisis. So if it's still a crisis, then what has been done? And I guess the real question is what needs to be done. From your position as someone who is engaged in fighting for civil rights, what do you think are some of the remedies to dealing with this massive issue of race?
Where do we start? It's only been 400 years now. Come on. Well, I've been around long enough to recognize the various institutions in the city of Cleveland, the state of Ohio, that were rigidly segregated, and the efforts that were undertaken to eliminate and address that segregation. I'm thinking not only of the public schools, but I'm thinking of things like the police department. For a long time, you could only become a policeman if you had parents that were police officers. You got extra points. If you happen to be of a certain ethnicity, you got additional points. Now, no one ever said that if you happen to be white, you got a better or an easier path to becoming a police officer. But the practical effect was that black people that aspired to be police officers had a more difficult road. And as a result, there had to be litigation to desegregate the Cleveland police. And now we have, we did just have a black man who was chief of police. And if you look back, it was 1967 that Cleveland was the first major city to elect a black man to be its mayor. But that black man had all kinds of difficulty with the various institutions that were fighting hard to maintain the status quo. So if we look at schools, if we look at policemen, if we look at the fire department, if we look at what the Justice Department more recently had to do when they came in and did a thorough investigation, forcing the city of Cleveland to enter into a consent decree to improve its police department, then you recognize that we made some progress, but we still got a long, long, long way to go. I can remember as a young man attempting to rent an apartment and being told we're not an open neighborhood just yet. I can remember as a child going into movie theaters, not in Cleveland, but in various parts of the South, and being relegated to the balcony, whereas the white patrons were permitted to sit wherever they wanted to. So those types of institutions have been permitted for far too long to exist. And if you look at the history of litigation around those issues, you see that we made some progress. The 64 Civil Rights Act, particularly Title VII, kind of got us headed in the right direction. But employment discrimination still exists. Employers are just more sophisticated in the manner in which they discriminate. They're not going to say, we don't want your kind working here. But if you look at the numbers and the statistics, they suggest that there must be something amiss when disproportionately Black people are excluded. So I guess in areas of schools, police and fire, employment, we've made some progress. But when we look around, that progress has not been nearly enough or fast enough. And so though organizations like the NAACP should have worked itself out of a job by now, there is still a burning need for those organizations to continue to remind people that we've still got a long, long, long way to go.
Yes. You know, I was also thinking about unions and how unions were used as a tool to keep Black people out of certain professions. And I'm looking at the fight that the local minority contractors group that they've been dealing with. They brought Al Sharpton to town last year because they were upset with Sherwin-Williams that they didn't get a piece of that pie. And so, you know, all of that, what good did it do? Nothing changed about that situation, you know. And I'm just thinking now, what can we do differently than we've done before? Because obviously the things that Dr. King was involved in back then may have been effective in raising consciousness, but now folks have protests and the media doesn't show up. So what's the point?
Well, the point is we have made progress slowly and incrementally. We made progress. But now the types of discrimination is somewhat different in the sense that the people that are in charge, I don't want to say the man, but the man is more sophisticated today than he was back when King was walking across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Or Thurgood Marshall argued for Brown versus the Board of Education as separate being inherently unequal. The landscape has changed, but discrimination remains a hot button topic. I made reference to the police and their the findings by the Department of Justice that the Cleveland police were intentionally violating the rights of citizens, primarily Black citizens. So They don't put the dogs on it. They still do a lot of things that have the practical effect.
One thing that they can do is show up and within 2 seconds take a life, such as they did with Tamir Rice.
Yes.
I want to talk to you about a few other things that have been burning a hole in my mind. We'll get to those when we get back. This is Open Door with Vince Robinson on 95.9 FM WOVU, Burton Belcar Community Radio. We'll be right back.
This is DJ Chris Dowes, Programs and Music Director here at WOVU 95.9 FM. Our Voices United, a Burton Belcar community radio station. WOVU 95.9 FM sends a big thank you to the entire staff of the St. Luke's Foundation and President and CEO Timothy Tramble for awarding WOVU 95.9 FM $25,000 to purchase the WOVU 95.9 FM mobile vehicle. On behalf of our entire team, our Executive Director, Joy Johnson, and Executive Board, we said thank you, St. Luke's Foundation, for continuing addressing social determinants of health for our people in our neighborhoods and throughout Cuyahoga County. Thank you. This message is being brought to you by WOVU 95.9 FM. Our Voices United, a Burton Belcar community radio station.
Welcome back to Open Door. My guest is attorney Jim Hardiman. He has an extensive history in the fight for civil rights in America and specifically right here in Cleveland, Ohio. Jim, you talked about the work that you have done with the NAACP, and I noted in your bio that I found somewhere else online that you actually acted as president on 4 different occasions. The NAACP continues to be relevant, and I say that having a father who served as a president for 19 years in the Ross County branch and a sister who is currently president of that same branch. I just want to talk to you about how necessary and how vital it is to have an organization such as the NAACP.
Well, if you are a student of history, you'll know that the NAACP was originally formed and created to address lynchings that were going on in the United States. And it became known as the Niagara Movement. And they felt that they had to go over to Niagara, Canada, to have a meeting and to try and resolve or address issues that were taking place in the United States. During the time that the NAACP has been in existence, they have been the forefront of the vast majority of the legal and even ethical changes that have occurred in the United States. Now, they're not the only ones fighting the fight, but they're one of the few organizations that started in the early part of the 19th century and exist today because they have not been successful in working themselves out of a job. There should be no need in 2024 to have an NAACP, but as long as police disproportionately discriminate against black people under the guise of, well, it was a high crime area, then we will continue to have issues where black people are mistreated. We'll continue to have issues where voting lines are drawn with a discriminatory purpose. We'll continue to have instances where schools are segregated on the basis of race, that black people cannot get jobs for which they are qualified. And if we suddenly had a country that was committed to what our founding fathers paid lip service to, it would be a different situation. I'm thinking of, what to the Negro is the 4th of July, if you're familiar with that. If not, look it up. Frederick Douglass wrote it, and I think it still applies today. In a few days, we'll be celebrating the 4th of July. It's a great holiday, but a lot of people, even though Juneteenth is a national holiday, don't recognize Juneteenth as having any relevance or significance. So when I deal with people, one of the questions they ask me is, well, what has the NAACP done? They haven't done anything for me. Well, that's kind of a narrow view of what they have accomplished, because they are working tirelessly with few rewards or even accolades for what they are trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish. And they can't do it without people that are willing to step up and be counted. Oftentimes we don't have the resources, and we try to do as much as we can with as few resources that we have. But I think the battle is worthwhile, because, to coin a tired phrase, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So we've got to continue the fight. We've got to support the organizations that are supporting us.
Yeah, and I so agree, Jim. Just looking at the work that my father did and the work that my sister is currently doing, and knowing that their presence in the community does have an impact, and I have seen how they've been sought after to get involved in certain situations that involve race and try to bring some type of justice into that situation, and then I can only think, well, what if they weren't there? Then what would have happened? So,
right.
It's definitely something that's vital. And, oftentimes people don't really understand the value of something until they come knocking at the door saying, can you help me with this?
Well, Strange, you should mention that. But oftentimes when people contact the NAACP and are seeking assistance, one of the questions I used to ask is, well, you're a member, aren't you? Well, no, I had one back in 1967, but I let it lapse. But I'm going to get one as soon as I can. The reality is most of the people that the NAACP tries to help are not supporters of the NAACP. They don't have a membership, either a recurring membership or a life membership. They don't make a contribution, and they fail to see the relevance. Now, one thing that I did notice when I was with the ACLU of Ohio was that contributors would contribute year after year after year. Whereas with the NAACP, if someone buys a $25 or $30 membership, they think they've done all that needs to be done until they get harassed by the police, until they get terminated from a job for which they were qualified, until they are forced to go to a school that's segregated on the basis of race. That's when they say, I have to go and contact the NAACP. And hopefully they can do something. We could do a lot more if people would support the goals and objectives of the organization that is trying to make America a better place.
Mm. Speaking of America being a better place, I know you had some thoughts about Euclid Beach, and I want to invite you to share those thoughts.
Well, as a child, I went to Euclid Beach on a somewhat regular basis. And there was an article in Cleveland.com just recently, one of those nostalgic pieces that talked about how great Euclid Beach was back in the 40s and 50s, and how people still had warm and fuzzy feelings about Euclid Beach. And I remember going to Euclid Beach, and I remember that they had a skating rink and they had a dance floor, but conspicuous by its absence, there were no black people on the skating rink or on the dance floor. And then after doing a little research, I came across some articles about what happened in 1946. Now, in 1946, you'll remember, we're 1 year out of World War II. But Euclid Beach had a policy that black people were not permitted on the skating rink, and black people were not permitted on the dance floor. And civil rights organizations, primarily the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided they were going to challenge that. And a number of black people made it a point to go to Euclid Beach and demand that they be permitted to enter the dance floor. As a result of that, there were some race riots. One policeman was actually shot. Black people were attacked and beaten rather severely. So, for some people, their recollection of Euclid Beach is, nice, and it was a great place to go, get some popcorn and, ride the racing coasters. But for other people, it was a place that just reinforced the segregated nature of the city of Cleveland. And the race riots never should have happened. They were avoidable, and there was no justification because some of the people that were denied access to Euclid Beach had fought in World War II. Many of them were returning veterans, and yet, though they fought to make the world a better place in Europe and in parts of the Pacific Island, they couldn't even go onto a dance floor in their hometown. And following the race riots of 46, they turned the dancing and the roller rink over to a private company. And eventually Euclid Beach shut down to avoid the high cost of operating an amusement park, probably the high cost of paying insurance. But more importantly, the reality that Black people were demanding access to this facility. So it became obvious that as we became more demanding, there were certain entities, including Euclid Beach, that decided, well, we'll discriminate against you on the basis of race. And more importantly, we won't let you access our facilities. And if you demand it, we'll close down. And that's kind of what happened.
Okay. We're winding down the program, but I just wanted to bring this up because it's something that's kind of been in the forefront of my mind lately, and that's the issue of gentrification. We're seeing a transformation of our city. Ironically, we're seeing more Black folks move over to the West Side for whatever reason. Yeah. But I'm just wondering, what your thoughts about the gentrification that is at hand right now, and what types of remedies there could be for that. Property values go up. Folks are on fixed incomes. They can't afford the property taxes anymore, and then they're kind of pushed out of their home, so to speak. What can we be doing about that now?
Well, some of the solutions are extremely controversial. I'm thinking about the Ludlow area in Shaker Heights. Shaker Heights was one of the first, at least the Ludlow area was one of the early areas that were welcoming. But then as Black people started to become the majority, there was some concern. Wait a minute. Now, do we keep qualified Black people out just so we can maintain some semblance of racial balance? And I think a similar issue exists in the city. You're right that oftentimes Black folks on fixed incomes that have lived in certain neighborhoods for years are being pushed out. If I come in and I want to develop a certain area so that I can have a place to live for my Cleveland Clinic or university hospital employees, then I've got to build up an infrastructure that will enable them to have a safe neighborhood. Now, if some Black people who used to live there can't afford it, so be it. So I think this is something that the government has got to at least consider. And though I'm not a big fan of rent control, it may be something that would have to be studied and, if necessary, implemented, because if nothing else, we can't afford to push all the people that made Cleveland great out of the city into the poor suburbs. I'm being somewhat facetious about that, but right. That's my thought.
Well, let's hope that if such a study does occur, that it won't take the route that the reparations bill that John Conyers proposed, because it was tabled for a long time, and it's probably in a coffin somewhere right now.
Or a circular wastebasket.
A circular wastebasket. James Hardiman, it has been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and I think we're going to have to revisit this because there's so much that we weren't able to talk about today that I want to get to, so we're going to have you back. Thanks for joining me today on Open Door.
I appreciate you having me. Have a good one.
All right. And to those who are listening, as always, know yourself, love yourself, be yourself. Make today your best day. Peace.